What if the beings who created humanity weren't immortal at all? What if buried somewhere in the oldest texts on Earth is a warning, not for humans, but for gods themselves? In the dust-swept ruins of ancient Nineveh, beneath layers of burned brick and forgotten centuries, archaeologists recovered tablets that spoke of divine blood spilled on sacred ground, of weapons that could wound the unwoundable, of a substance, a method, a secret so dangerous that its very name was scratched from the clay before the tablets were fired. These fragments are 5,000 years old. The scribes who pressed these warnings into wet mud did so with trembling hands, encoding knowledge too perilous to speak aloud, but too vital to let die. So before this story pulls you under, if you're drawn to histories that orthodox scholarship prefers to leave buried, consider subscribing. The silence between the words is where the truth still waits. What if the beings who created humanity were not immortal at all? And what if buried somewhere in the oldest texts on Earth is a warning written not for humans, but for the gods themselves? Because in the dust-swept ruins of ancient Nineveh, beneath layers of burned brick and forgotten centuries, archaeologists recovered tablets that spoke of divine blood spilled on sacred ground, and of weapons that could wound the unwoundable, and of a substance or method or secret so dangerous that its very name was scratched from the clay before the tablets were fired. And these fragments are 5,000 years old, preserved by the same flames that destroyed the great library of Ashurbanipal. And the scribes who pressed these warnings into wet mud did so with trembling hands, encoding knowledge too perilous to speak aloud, but too vital to let die, because they understood something that we have forgotten, that even creators can be destroyed, that even the architects of humanity walked in fear of something. And tonight, as the world quiets around you and your thoughts begin to slow, we are going to follow the trail they left behind through fragmentary texts and damaged tablets, through comparative mythology, and the strange silences where crucial information should be, but is not, through the gaps in the record that might be accidents of time or might be something else entirely, because the ancients knew what could kill an Anunnaki, and they were afraid to write it clearly, but they were more afraid to let the knowledge vanish completely, so they hid it in plain sight, scattered across traditions, separated by oceans and millennia, waiting for someone patient enough to gather the pieces and brave enough to ask what they mean. So before this story pulls you under, if you are drawn to histories that orthodox scholarship prefers to leave buried, consider subscribing, because the silence between the words is where the truth still waits. And tonight, we are going to listen very carefully to what that silence contains. Let your breathing slow now as we descend deeper into the ancient record, into the moment when divinity became mortal and mortality received something divine. The Atrahasis epic, that remarkable text preserved on clay tablets from the reign of Babylonian king Ammi-Saduqa around 1646 BCE, contains what might be the most significant passage in all of Mesopotamian literature, a passage that scholars have analyzed for over a century without fully grasping its implications, or perhaps grasping them and choosing to look away. The text describes a divine assembly, a council of the great gods gathered to solve a crisis in heaven, and the solution they devise as nothing short of astonishing. Let one god be slaughtered, the text declares, and let the gods be purified by immersion. From his flesh and blood let Ninhursag mix clay. God and man shall be mixed together in the clay. These are not vague poetic metaphors. These are instructions. This is a procedure described with the clinical precision of a recipe, a formula, a protocol for creating something new from something that must be destroyed. The god chosen for this sacrifice is named Wa-ilu in some translations, Geshtu-i in others, and the text is remarkably specific about why he was chosen. He was a god who had temu, a word that translates variously as intelligence, understanding, rationality, or perhaps most accurately, the capacity for conscious thought. Of all the divine beings who could have been selected for sacrifice, the gods specifically chose one whose defining characteristic was his mind, his awareness, his ability to think and reason and understand. This was not random. This was deliberate. They wanted to transfer something specific into the clay, something beyond mere life force, something that would make the created beings capable of understanding orders, following commands, learning skills, perhaps eventually understanding things their creators never intended them to understand. The sacrifice itself is described in terms that should disturb anyone who has been taught that gods are immortal and invulnerable. Wa-ilu was slaughtered. The Akkadian word used suggests a butchering, a killing with purpose, the same terminology used for sacrificial animals. His blood was collected, his flesh was prepared. These divine materials were then mixed with clay from the Abzu, the primordial freshwater ocean that existed beneath the earth, the purest and most fundamental substance of creation. And from this mixture, this combination of divine essence and earthly matter, humanity was fashioned. Stop for a moment and let that settle into your awareness. A god died so that we could exist. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but in the narrative logic of the text, literally. Divine blood was spilled. Divine flesh was rendered. A conscious, intelligent, thinking being was destroyed, and from his destruction we emerged. If you have ever wondered where consciousness comes from, where the spark of awareness originates that makes you capable of lying here tonight, wondering about ancient mysteries, the Sumerians had an answer. It came from a slaughtered god. It was transferred through blood. It lives in you now, passed down through 100,000 generations, diluted perhaps, but never fully extinguished, the inheritance of divine murder. The concept of blood in Mesopotamian thought was far more sophisticated than we might initially assume. The word damu meant blood, yes, but it carried implications that extended far beyond the merely physical. Blood was the carrier of life essence, the medium through which consciousness flowed, the substance that made the difference between living and dead, between aware and inert. When the texts speak of Wa-ilu's blood being mixed with clay, they are describing a transfer of essence, a transfusion of something we might call soul or spirit or consciousness, from a divine vessel into an earthly one. The blood did not simply animate the clay the way breath might animate a bellows. It transformed the clay into something capable of thought, of feeling, of wondering about its own origins. This is why the choice of Wa-ilu was so significant. A god without temu, a god of mere power or mere function, would have provided life force but not intelligence. The created beings would have been animated but not aware, functioning but not thinking, useful as beasts of burden but not as the sophisticated servants the gods required. By choosing a god whose defining attribute was conscious intelligence, the divine council ensured that their creations would inherit not just life, but awareness, and not just existence, but understanding. And here is where we encounter something that should profoundly unsettle any simple reading of these texts. If the gods could take the intelligence from one of their own, if they could harvest consciousness and transfer it, if they could kill a thinking being and use his essence for their purposes, then several uncomfortable possibilities emerge. The gods were not immortal in any absolute sense. They could die. Their consciousness could be extracted. Their essential nature could be transferred to other vessels. Whatever made them divine was not inherent to their being, but something that resided in them, something that could be removed, relocated, potentially stolen. This is where we must introduce one of the most fascinating and overlooked concepts in Mesopotamian theology, a concept that has profound implications for understanding divine vulnerability. The me, pronounced like the English word may, were the divine decrees or powers that the gods possessed. But possessed is perhaps the wrong word, because it implies permanent ownership, and the me were anything but permanently attached to their holders. The me were more like divine technologies, cosmic authorities, fundamental powers of civilization and nature that could be held by gods but also transferred between them. The me included things like kingship, the throne of heaven, the exalted scepter, the staff, the holy measuring rod, shepherdship, the supreme cult rites, the resounding musical instrument, the art of song, venerable old age, heroism, power, hostility, straightforwardness, the destruction of cities, lamentation, rejoicing of the heart, deceit, the trembling of the heart, prostitution, law, libel, art, the cult chamber, the hierodule of heaven, musical instruments, and dozens more. Some were abstract qualities, some were objects, some were roles, some were emotions, but all were powers that gods could hold and, crucially, could lose. The myth of Inanna and Enki describes exactly such a transfer. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, visits Enki, the god of wisdom, in his city of Eridu. Enki, perhaps inebriated on divine beer, perhaps manipulated by Inanna's legendary cunning, gives her the me one by one. He hands over the fundamental powers of civilization, the authorities that made him one of the most powerful gods in the pantheon. When he sobers up and realizes what he has done, he sends servants to retrieve them, but Inanna has already fled with her cargo. The me are gone. Enki's power is diminished. Inanna's power is increased. And note what this implies. Divine power in Mesopotamian thought was not inherent but held. It was not absolute but transferable. It could be given away, and by extension, it could be taken. The gods were not omnipotent beings whose power flowed from their fundamental nature. They were holders of power, custodians of cosmic authorities, beings who possessed the me, but could potentially be dispossessed of them. This entirely changes how we should understand divine mortality. If the me could be transferred, if divine essence could be extracted through blood, if intelligence itself could be harvested from a slaughtered god, then the Anunnaki were vulnerable in ways that challenge every assumption about divine nature. They were not immortal in the philosophical sense of being incapable of death. They were long-lived, certainly. They were powerful, undoubtedly. But they were not immune to destruction. Something could end them. Something could take what made them divine. And if this is true, then a terrible question emerges. A question the ancient scribes may have been encoding in their careful clinical descriptions of Wee-Ilu's sacrifice. The question is this: if a god can be killed for a purpose, if divine consciousness can be harvested and transferred, could the same thing be done without consent? Could a god be slaughtered not to create, but to destroy? Could the me be taken not as gifts, but as spoils of war? Could the very techniques used to create humanity be turned against the creators themselves? Consider the psychology of the Anunnaki as presented in these texts. They are not serene beings existing in eternal bliss. They labor, they quarrel, they scheme against each other, they hold grudges for millennia, they fear. Yes, they fear. The gods in these narratives are afraid of overpopulation, afraid of noise, afraid of their creations becoming too numerous and too powerful. Enlil sends plagues to thin the human population. When plagues fail, he sends droughts. When droughts fail, he sends the flood. This is not the behavior of omnipotent beings secure in their power. This is the behavior of rulers who feel threatened, who sense that their control might be slipping, who recognize in their creations a potential danger that must be managed through periodic culling. And what was the danger? The texts are not entirely clear, but there are hints. The noise that disturbed Enlil was not merely physical sound. The Akkadian word rigmu can mean noise, but also implies clamor, complaint, rebellion. The humans were becoming numerous, yes, but they were also becoming restless, organized, potentially capable of challenging the divine order. They had inherited intelligence from Wei-Ilu. They had inherited the capacity for thought, for planning, for wondering about their origins and their purpose. Perhaps they were beginning to wonder about other things too. Perhaps they were beginning to ask questions that the gods preferred not to answer. Questions like, if we carry divine blood, are we not partially divine ourselves? If consciousness was transferred to us, do we not share in the nature of the gods? And if we Ilu could be killed, could his killers not be killed as well? These are dangerous questions. These are the kinds of questions that could lead to revolution, to the overturning of cosmic order, to the created rising against the creators. And if the humans began asking these questions, if they began to understand the true nature of divine power as something held rather than inherent, as something that could be transferred and therefore taken, the implications would be catastrophic for the divine ruling class. This may be why the forbidden knowledge was forbidden, not because it described how to build weapons or mix poisons, but because it revealed the fundamental nature of divine existence itself. The gods could die, they could be killed, their power could be taken. And the beings they had created, the beings who carried divine blood and divine intelligence, might someday become the instruments of their destruction. Let that thought drift through your awareness as you settle deeper into relaxation. You are lying in the dark, breathing slowly, perhaps already drifting towards sleep. But in your cells, in your blood, something ancient continues its endless replication. Whatever was transferred from Wei-Ilu to the first humans has passed through an unbroken chain of ancestors to reach you. The intelligence that allows you to contemplate these mysteries is, according to the texts, divine in origin. You are, in some sense, the Sumerians would recognize, part God. Not a god yourself, certainly. Not immortal, not possessing the me, not wielding divine power, but carrying within you a fragment of something that once thought divine thoughts, that once held divine powers, that once existed among the Anunnaki as an equal. And that fragment, that inheritance, that drop of ancient blood diluted through millennia, but never entirely washed away, still does what it has always done. It wonders, it questions, it seeks to understand. It asks the dangerous questions that the gods feared humanity would someday ask. The Atrahasis text continues past the creation narrative to describe what happened next. The first humans were created, 14 of them, 7 male and 7 female, gestated in the wombs of birth goddesses who served as surrogate mothers. They grew, they multiplied, they did the work the gods had created them to do. They dug canals and tilled fields and built temples and offered sacrifices. They were, by all accounts, successful creations. The experiment worked. But then they became too numerous, too noisy, too troublesome. And Enlil, disturbed in his divine rest, began to seek their destruction. First came plagues that ravaged the population. Enki, the god who had designed the creation process, secretly helped humanity survive by teaching them about healing herbs and protective rituals. Then came droughts that parched the fields and starved the herds. Again, Enki intervened, teaching irrigation techniques and food preservation. Each time Enlil tried to cull the human population, Enki found ways to save them. This divine disagreement is revealing. Enki, who had personally designed the extraction process that killed Wei-Ilu, who understood better than any other god exactly what had been transferred into humanity, consistently sided with his creations. Why? The texts do not say explicitly, but we can speculate. Perhaps Enki felt responsibility for what he had made. Perhaps he saw in humanity something worth preserving. Or perhaps, most disturbingly, he saw in humanity something useful, something that might eventually serve purposes the other gods could not imagine. If humans carried divine intelligence, if they could learn and grow and accumulate knowledge across generations, if they were capable of the same kind of conscious thought that characterized the gods themselves, then they were not merely workers. They were potential, and potential is dangerous precisely because it is unpredictable. When Enlil finally convinced the Divine Council to authorize the flood, to wipe humanity from the earth entirely and start over, Enki still found a way to preserve a remnant. He warned Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise one, instructing him to build a boat and save his family and representative animals. The flood came, devastating and complete, covering the earth and destroying everything. But when the waters receded, when the survivors made their offering and the sweet smoke rose to heaven, the gods realized what they had lost. They had destroyed their workers. They had eliminated their worshippers. They had killed the beings who provided their offerings, maintained their temples, kept their cults alive. And they were hungry. The texts describe the gods gathering around the sacrifice like flies, desperate for the sustenance that human worship provided. This is remarkable. The gods needed humanity, not just as workers, not just as servants, but as a source of something essential, something the gods themselves could not provide for each other. The nature of this dependency is never fully explained in the surviving texts, but its existence is clear. Divine and human were bound together in a relationship of mutual need. The gods provided structure, order, power. Humans provided worship, offerings, something that the gods required to maintain their divine existence. After the flood, new arrangements were made. Humanity would continue, but with built-in limitations. Death would claim more children. Fertility would be restricted. Lifespans would be shortened. The dangerous potential that had alarmed Enlil would be constrained, managed, prevented from ever again reaching the critical mass that threatened divine order. But the fundamental vulnerability remained. Gods could die. Gods had died. The evidence was written in every human cell, in the inherited intelligence that allowed for wonder and questioning, and the slow accumulation of dangerous knowledge. So we know at least one god died, was killed in the very act of creating us. We carry his blood in our veins, if the texts speak literally. Something of Wee Ilu's consciousness persists in the species he died to create, thinking thoughts that are in some sense descended from divine thoughts, asking questions that are in some sense divine questions turned toward the questioner's own makers. But this raises a question that should trouble us, a question that haunted the ancient scribes and perhaps haunts us still. If one god could be killed for a purpose, could others be killed against their will? Was there something the Anunnaki feared? Was there somewhere, encoded in the fragmentary tablets we have barely begun to understand, knowledge of how divine existence could be ended not in sacrifice, but in violence, not for creation, but for destruction? The texts suggest there was. The gaps in the record suggest someone tried to hide it. And the very existence of humanity, created from the blood of a thinking God, suggests that the answer, if it exists anywhere, might already be inside us, waiting to be remembered. The weapons of the Anunnaki were not abstractions or metaphors for natural forces, but specific instruments of divine violence, described with the kind of technical precision that suggests the scribes believed they were documenting actual armaments, because the texts speak of arrows that speak before they strike, and of maces forged from metals that exist only in the heavens, and of nets woven from divine light that could trap even the mightiest of celestial beings. And the storm god Ishkur wielded lightning not as a symbol of his power, but as a literal weapon hurled at enemies with devastating effect. And Ninurta carried the Sharur, a mace that could communicate with its wielder, offering counsel during battle, as if the weapon itself possessed intelligence and agency. And these were not invincible beings, casually gesturing destruction into existence, but warriors who required tools, who needed implements designed specifically to harm other divine entities, which raises the unsettling question of why such weapons would need to exist at all, if the gods were truly immortal and truly invulnerable. Because you do not forge a spear unless something can be pierced, and you do not craft divine armor unless something can wound what the armor protects. And beyond the weapons themselves, the texts reveal something perhaps even more significant about the nature of these beings, because after humanity was created, after the labor of shaping the first humans from clay and divine blood, the texts explicitly state that the gods rested. And the word used is not ceremonial rest, not the symbolic cessation of activity that a truly omnipotent being might perform for ritualistic purposes, but actual rest. The kind that implies exhaustion, the kind that suggests biological limitation, the kind that reveals the gods had labored and were tired and needed to recover their strength. And consider what this means. Because an exhausted god is a depleted god, and a depleted god is a vulnerable god. And if the Anunnaki could grow weary from creation, then they could grow weary from battle. And if they could grow weary from battle, then there would be moments of weakness. Moments when even the mightiest among them might be overcome, and the pattern becomes clearer with each fragment we examine. Because these were not the omnipotent, omniscient, eternal beings that later religious traditions would imagine, but powerful entities. Yes, immensely powerful entities, but entities nonetheless with needs and limitations and vulnerabilities that the texts describe with remarkable consistency across multiple tablets from multiple periods and multiple cities, all pointing toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. And so, we have wars between gods and weapons that wound the divine, and a hierarchy that could be challenged and could shift. And the picture emerging from these fragments is not of absolute beings beyond all harm, but of powerful entities with real vulnerabilities, real needs, real fears. And yet, there is something else in these texts, something mentioned only obliquely, something that appears in damaged passages and coded language, as if the scribes themselves were afraid to write it clearly, as if setting down certain knowledge in permanent form might itself be dangerous. And it is to these shadows between the words, these deliberate silences and strategic omissions, that we must now turn our attention. There, because what the Anunnaki feared most was not recorded in the places where scholars typically look, but hidden in the gaps left by trembling hands that knew some truths were too dangerous to preserve openly, yet too vital to let vanish entirely from human memory. The tablet designated K.2606 in the British Museum collection presents a puzzle that has troubled Assyriologists for over a century, because across its surface, running through precisely the passages that scholars most wish to read, are deep scratches that obliterate keywords and phrases. And the damage is not random, not the careless erosion of time or the accidental breakage of excavation, but deliberate, systematic, targeted, as if someone took a stylus or sharp implement and methodically destroyed specific information while leaving the surrounding text perfectly legible. And this tablet is not alone, because scattered across museum collections in London and Paris and Berlin and Baghdad are dozens of fragments showing the same pattern of intentional damage. And the question that haunts researchers who spend their careers studying these texts is simple and disturbing. Who damaged them and why? And when you begin to catalogue what has been destroyed, a pattern emerges because the obliterated passages cluster around certain themes, around the true names of divine beings, around substances said to affect the gods, around rituals, whose purposes are described only in the vaguest terms, and around references to knowledge that the texts themselves describe as dangerous, forbidden, too powerful for mortal minds to safely contain. And this brings us to one of the strangest and most consistent features of ancient Near Eastern religion, the concept of secret names and the terrifying power they were believed to hold. In the ancient world, names were not mere labels, not arbitrary sounds assigned to distinguish one thing from another, but containers of essence, carriers of power. Fundamental truths about the nature of the named. And this belief appears across virtually every ancient culture, but nowhere more prominently than in Mesopotamia and Egypt, where elaborate theological systems developed around the protection and concealment of divine names. And the logic was straightforward and chilling, because to know the true name of a being was to have power over that being, to be able to summon it, compel it, bind it to your will. And this applied not only to demons and spirits, but to the gods themselves, who guarded their true names with extraordinary care, surrounding them with layers of titles and epithets and public names that could be spoken safely while the real A name, the name of power, remained hidden, known only to the god, and perhaps to one or two trusted divine intimates, and the lengths to which the god supposedly went to protect these names suggests that the threat was real, that names genuinely conferred vulnerability, that speaking the unspeakable could wound even the unwoundable. Now consider the Egyptian myth of Ra and Isis, one of the most explicit accounts of divine vulnerability through naming that survives from the ancient world. Because in this story, Ra, the supreme sun god, the creator and sustainer of all existence, has grown old and feeble. And Isis, who desires his power above all things, devises a plan, and she creates a serpent from dust, mixed with a spittle that drools from Ra, aging mouth. And this serpent bites the god and poisons him with venom that burns through his divine flesh. And Ra, who created all things, including every poison, and its remedy, cannot heal himself, because this venom was made from his own essence, turned against him. And he writhes in agony, calling out to all the gods for help, but none can cure him, and Isis approaches and offers to heal him, but only if he tells her his secret name, his true name, the name of power that he has never spoken to any living being. And Ra resists, and the poison spreads, and the pain intensifies and finally broken by suffering. The supreme god surrenders his name, and with it a portion of his power passes to Isis, forever diminished by the revelation. And this is not a minor myth, not a folktale told to children, but a central text in Egyptian magical practice, because the spells that invoke Ra often reference this moment. Remind the god that his name is known, that he can be compelled, that his power is not absolute. And if the Egyptians believed this about Ra, the greatest of their gods, what did the Mesopotamians believe about the Anunnaki? The Sumerian and Akkadian texts are more circumspect than the Egyptian sources, more careful about recording such dangerous information. But fragments survive that suggest similar beliefs, similar vulnerabilities, similar power in names, and in the magical texts known as the Maklu series, which deal primarily with combating witchcraft. We find incantations that reference the secret names of various divine beings, used as sources of power for the speaker. And in the Shopu series, another collection of magical texts even more explicitly tied to purification and the breaking of curses. There are passages that seem to invoke hidden divine names, names that are written with unusual signs or with determinatives that indicate they should not be pronounced aloud. And the very existence of such texts suggests that the Mesopotamians, like the Egyptians, believed that divine names held power that could be harnessed or turned against their bearers. And if this is true, then the deliberate destruction of passages containing such names begins to make sense, because someone at some point decided that this knowledge was too dangerous to preserve, that even recording a divine name in clay created a vulnerability, that the name could be read and spoken and used. And so they took their styluses, and they scratched and they scraped, and they obliterated, leaving gaps in our understanding that may have been meant to remain gaps forever. But names were not the only dangerous knowledge the ancient texts sought to conceal, because scattered through the mythological corpus are references to substances that affected the gods in ways that ordinary matter should not be able to affect immortal beings. And the most famous of these are the plant of life and the water of life, sought by Gilgamesh in his epic journey to the ends of the earth. Substances said to confer immortality and eternal youth, and restore the vitality of those who consume them. And on the surface, this seems like a straightforward quest. the mortal king seeking what mortals lack, the gift of deathlessness that the gods enjoy. And this is how the story is usually interpreted, as a meditation on mortality, on the human condition, on accepting our limitations and finding meaning despite our finite existence. And all of this is true as far as it goes. But there is something strange in the details, something that scholars tend to gloss over. Because if the gods are inherently immortal, if deathlessness is simply part of their nature in the way that wetness is part of water, then why do substances that confer immortality exist at all? And why do the gods guard them so jealously? And why does Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who has been granted immortality by the gods, need to eat from the plant of life to maintain his condition? And the answer that suggests itself is disturbing, because it implies that divine immortality is not inherent, but maintained not a natural state, but an artificial one requiring regular consumption of specific substances. And if that is true, then a god deprived of access to these substances would not remain immortal forever, and a god would become like any other mortal creature, subject to age and decay and death. The plant of life appears in several Mesopotamian texts under various names and descriptions, and in the Gilgamesh epic, it is described as growing at the bottom of the cosmic ocean, the Abzu, accessible only through a treacherous dive, and it has thorns like roses that tear the hands of anyone who grasps it. And Gilgamesh succeeds in obtaining it despite the dangers. But on his return journey, he stops to bathe in a cool pool, and a serpent smells the fragrance of the plant and rises from the water and steals it and slithers away, shedding its skin as it goes. And Gilgamesh weeps because his chance at immortality has been taken by a snake who will now live forever, while he returns to Uruk to age and die like every mortal. And the story is beautiful and tragic and philosophically rich, but it also contains specific details that we should not overlook. Because it tells us that the plant existed, that it was physical, not metaphorical, that it could be found in a specific location and obtained through specific actions, and that it could be stolen by a creature as common as a snake. And this suggests that immortality was a transferable quality, a property of certain substances that could be acquired by anyone or anything that consumed them. And if immortality could be gained in this way, then presumably it could also be lost. And this opens a door into speculation that the ancient texts seem deliberately designed to close, because if there were substances that conferred immortality, then perhaps there were also substances that did the opposite. And perhaps the gods knew this, and perhaps this is why certain passages in certain tablets have been so thoroughly destroyed. The evidence for such substances is fragmentary and obscured by the same forces that have hidden so much of this dangerous knowledge. But hints survive scattered across texts that were never meant to be read together. And in the medical and magical literature of Mesopotamia, we find references to plants and minerals and compounds that are described in terms usually reserved for weapons and poisons. And some of these references specify that the substances in question affect not just humans, but divine beings as well. And the scholarly literature tends to interpret these passages as metaphorical or hyperbolic, as poetic exaggeration not meant to be taken literally. But the pattern of such references, the consistency with which they appear across different text types and time periods, suggests something more, and one of the most intriguing fragments. And it comes from a late Babylonian ritual text that describes in partially legible terms a substance or combination of substances that could be used to temporarily bind or weaken a divine being. And the text is damaged at precisely the points where the specific ingredients would be named. And the remaining words describe the effects in terms that suggest genuine divine vulnerability, genuine reduction of power, genuine danger to beings that should be beyond all danger. And whether this represents actual ancient belief or later magical fantasy or something else entirely, we cannot say with certainty. But the fact that such texts exist, that ancient scribes committed such ideas to clay, suggests that somewhere in the depths of Mesopotamian religion lurked the knowledge that gods could be harmed, and that this knowledge was simultaneously preserved and hidden, remembered, and forbidden. The theme of forbidden knowledge runs throughout Mesopotamian literature, appearing in myths and hymns and wisdom texts with a consistency that suggests deep cultural importance. And the story of Adapa, one of the 7 sages who brought civilization to humanity after the flood, deals explicitly with the danger of knowing too much. And in this tale, Adapa, a priest of exceptional wisdom and purity, is summoned to heaven after he accidentally breaks the wings of the south wind, and the god Ea, who is Adapa patron, warns him not to eat or drink anything offered to him in heaven, claiming that it will be the food and water of death meant to poison him. And Adapa obeys his divine master and refuses the hospitality of Anu, the king of heaven. But what Anu actually offered was the food and water of life, the same substances that would have granted Adapa the immortality, and so, through obedience to his god, through following instructions meant to protect him, Adapa loses his chance at eternal life and returns to earth to die like any other mortal. And the story is usually read as an explanation for human mortality, as a myth about why we die while the gods live forever. But there is another reading possible, because Ea, who gave Adapa the fatal advice, knew exactly what would be offered in heaven and deliberately deceived his faithful servant. And the question is why? And one answer is that Ea, the wisest of the gods, did not want a human to obtain immortality, did not want the boundary between mortal and divine to be crossed. And if that is true, then the gods were actively working to keep humanity limited, to prevent us from accessing the substances and knowledge that would make us their equals. And what else might they have hidden from us? And what knowledge was so dangerous that even the fragments that survive have been systematically mutilated? The magical texts of ancient Mesopotamia offer another window into forbidden knowledge, because magic in Mesopotamian culture was not superstition or fraud, but a recognized technology, a set of techniques for manipulating reality through the proper combination of words and substances and rituals. And the texts that preserve these techniques were not hidden in attics or buried in tombs, but maintained in temple libraries, copied by scribes trained in their use, and consulted by priests and exorcists as part of their professional duties. And yet, even within this relatively open tradition of magical practice, there were hierarchies of knowledge and levels of secrecy and techniques that could only be transmitted orally, never written down. And the texts themselves sometimes reference this hidden knowledge, describe rituals that require ingredients whose names cannot be recorded, or invocations that must be whispered directly from teacher to student. And what was so dangerous about this knowledge that even professional magicians were forbidden to write it clearly? And the most obvious answer is that some of this knowledge concerned the gods themselves, their vulnerabilities, their secret names, their fears, and that recording such information would create the possibility of its misuse, would arm anyone who could read cuneiform with power over divine beings, and so the most dangerous knowledge was transmitted through whisper networks, through initiatory traditions, through the careful passing of secrets from master to apprentice. And when those chains of transmission broke, when the temples were destroyed, and the priests killed, and the students scattered, the knowledge was lost. And all that remains are the hints in the texts, the references to what cannot be written, the gaps where crucial information should be. There is a curious pattern in Mesopotamian mythology that scholars have noted but rarely followed to its logical conclusion, because the gods of Mesopotamia do not form a harmonious family living in eternal peace, but rather a contentious assembly of powerful beings who scheme against each other, compete for status and power, and occasionally engage in open warfare. And the texts record conflicts between gods that sometimes result in permanent changes to the divine order, in gods being killed or imprisoned or transformed. And this is strange if gods are truly immortal, truly invulnerable. Because why would immortal beings fight? What could any conflict accomplish if no combatant could ever truly lose? And yet the myths describe weapons used by gods against gods, describe wounds inflicted on divine flesh, describe victories and defeats with real consequences. And one of the most significant of these conflicts is the battle between Marduk and Tiamat, recorded in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic. And in this battle, Tiamat, the primordial goddess of the Salt Sea, the mother of all the gods, is not merely defeated, but killed, and her body is used to create the heavens and the earth. And her consort Kingu is likewise slain, and his blood is used to create humanity. And these are not minor figures. These are primordial deities, the oldest and most powerful beings in the cosmos. And yet they are killed with weapons, killed through combat, killed in ways that demonstrate that divine flesh can be pierced. Divine life can be ended. Divine immortality is not absolute. Marduk's weapon against Tiamat is described in some detail, and its characteristics are interesting, because it is not merely a physical object, but seems to be a force or power possibly connected to the storm winds that Marduk commands. And he also uses a net to capture Tiamat, entrapping her before delivering the killing blow, and the image of a god caught in a net, bound and helpless. Despite her immense power, is significant because it suggests that even the mightiest beings could be constrained, that there were methods for limiting divine action, that the gods knew how to capture and hold each other. And if Tiamat could be caught and killed, if Kingu could be slaughtered for his blood, then the vulnerability of the gods was not a secret to the gods themselves, and they must have developed techniques for protecting themselves from each other, and perhaps those techniques could also be used against them by anyone who learned the secrets. And perhaps this is why the secrets were hidden, why the tablets were damaged, why the true names were never written, and why, when we search for what could kill an Anunnaki, we find gaps and silences, and the marks of styluses used not to write, but to destroy. The waters of the Abzu, the primordial freshwater ocean beneath the earth, held special significance in Mesopotamian thought, as both the source of life and a place of mysterious power. And the god Enki, whose domain was the Abzu, possessed knowledge that other gods did not. and guarded secrets that even his fellow Anunnaki could not access. And the Abzu appears in various texts as a place where substances of power could be found, where transformative processes occurred, where the boundaries between mortal and divine became permeable. And there are fragmentary references to rituals performed in or near the Abzu rituals, whose purposes are described only obliquely, that seem to involve the manipulation of divine essence itself. And one tantalizing fragment describes something being extracted from the Abzu, something that could be used to affect the me, the divine powers or properties that the gods possessed and held and sometimes transferred. And the text breaks off before specifying what this substance was or how it was used. But the implication is clear, because if the me could be affected by some substance from the Abzu, then the fundamental attributes of the gods were not fixed and eternal, but subject to change through material means, and a god whose me could be taken or altered or neutralized would be a god whose divinity itself was at risk. The concept of the me deserves careful consideration, because these were not abstract spiritual qualities, but seemed to function almost as technologies, as powers that could be possessed, transferred, stolen, and presumably lost. And the texts describe Inanna obtaining the me from Enki through trickery, getting him drunk and convincing him to give her dozens of divine powers, which she then carried back to her city of Uruk in her boat. And when Enki sobered up and realized what he had done, he sent creatures to recover the me. But Inanna escaped with her prizes, and thus Uruk became great. And this story is often read as a political myth explaining the rise of Uruk to prominence, but it also reveals something important about divine power. Because if the me could be transferred through intoxication and persuasion, if they were physical or quasi-physical, things that could be loaded into a boat and transported, then they were not inherent aspects of divine nature, but external attachments that could be separated from their bearers. And a god who lost all his me would presumably no longer be much of a god. And this suggests another avenue of vulnerability, because to kill an Anunnaki might not require destroying the divine body, but merely separating the god from the powers that made divinity meaningful and stripped of the me. An immortal being might continue to exist, but in a state of powerlessness that would be worse than death. The mystery deepens when we examine the few texts that seem to reference actual substances, dangerous to divine beings, because these texts are invariably damaged, incomplete, or written in language so obscure that scholars have offered widely varying interpretations, and one much discussed fragment appears to describe a plant or mineral that, when properly prepared, could disrupt the connection between a god and certain of the me, and another fragment, possibly from the same tablet references, something called the dust of death, or possibly the powder of annihilation. Though the translation is disputed, and a third fragment mentions specific metals, including copper and iron, and something that might be meteoric iron, or might be an alloy unknown to modern metallurgy. And whether these fragments represent genuine ancient beliefs about divine vulnerability, or later magical speculation or misinterpretation by modern scholars, remains unclear. But the pattern itself is significant, because across these damaged texts, we see repeated attempts to describe what should not be describable and record what should not be recorded. And the very existence of such attempts suggests that somewhere in the depths of Mesopotamian tradition, there was knowledge about affecting the gods that was considered simultaneously too important to forget and too dangerous to preserve clearly. The incantation literature of ancient Mesopotamia provides another angle of approach, because while most magical texts were designed to invoke divine assistance or ward off demonic attack, a few fragments suggest more aggressive applications, and in texts dealing with what the Akkadians called witchcraft. We find references to techniques that could theoretically be turned against any spiritual being, including the gods themselves. And the anti-witchcraft texts, while primarily defensive, contain descriptions of offensive magic that some scholars have interpreted as applicable to divine beings. And one particularly striking passage describes binding a god, or alternatively the god of another person, using specific substances and specific words. And the text is careful to frame this as countering hostile magic, as defensive rather than offensive. But the techniques described could clearly be used for other purposes, and the question arises whether such techniques were actually used, whether ancient Mesopotamians attempted to bind or harm the gods themselves. And the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, because any record of such attempts would presumably have been destroyed either by the religious authorities who would have considered it blasphemous, or by the practitioners themselves who would have guarded such dangerous knowledge with their lives. The destruction of temple libraries by invading armies and the collapse of the scribal traditions that maintained these texts means that we will never know the full extent of what was hidden and what was lost, and the tablets that survive are a tiny fraction of what once existed, selected not by us, but by the chances of preservation and destruction, and by the choices of ancient scribes and priests about what to copy and what to let fade. And within this already reduced body of evidence we find further reduction as passages are obliterated and tablets broken and crucial knowledge erased. And the pattern of this erasure suggests intentional intervention by people who understood what they were destroying and considered it too dangerous to preserve. And we can reconstruct some of what was lost by examining the gaps, by looking at what surrounds the destroyed passages, by comparing fragmentary texts to find overlaps that reveal hidden content. And through these techniques, scholars have recovered some information that someone went to great lengths to eliminate, but much remains inaccessible. And perhaps that is exactly what the ancient guardians of this knowledge intended, because they understood something that we, in our age of information abundance, tend to forget: that some knowledge is genuinely dangerous, that some secrets should not be spoken, and that the power to destroy is not always a power that should be used even when it exists. The ancients believed that certain knowledge was too dangerous to preserve clearly, and they encoded it and damaged it and buried it and surrounded it with prohibitions and taboos designed to prevent its recovery. But fragments survived because knowledge that important never quite dies, and because the very act of trying to suppress something calls attention to its significance. And when we compare these fragments to myths from other cultures, to stories told by peoples separated by oceans and millennia who could not possibly have had contact with ancient Mesopotamia, we find something that should be impossible, something that challenges our assumptions about independent cultural development and parallel evolution of ideas, because we find the same patterns emerging and the same divine vulnerabilities being described, and the same forbidden knowledge appearing in traditions that should have no connection whatsoever. And this convergence suggests one of two possibilities. Either all human cultures independently invented the same specific beliefs about divine mortality and vulnerability. Through some psychological necessity, we do not fully understand, or the knowledge is in some sense real, is describing something that was genuinely known in the distant past, something that was systematically hidden across cultures, something that the gods of every tradition wanted humanity to forget. And in the next passage of our journey, we will explore these comparative patterns, these parallel traditions, these echoes of forbidden knowledge appearing in Greece and Egypt and India and the far corners of the earth. Because what the Sumerians knew about killing gods, they were not alone in knowing. And the conspiracy of silence extends far beyond Mesopotamia. And now we must travel beyond Mesopotamia, beyond the clay tablets and the cuneiform script, beyond the boundaries of what we have been exploring, and into territory that should by all conventional understanding be entirely separate. Because what we find when we examine the mythologies of cultures that had no contact with ancient Sumer is something that defies easy explanation, and that something is the same pattern appearing again and again in traditions separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. The pattern of gods who could die, and let us begin in Egypt along the banks of the Nile, where one of the most fully documented divine deaths in any world mythology unfolds in elaborate and disturbing detail, because Osiris, the green-skinned god of fertility and the afterlife, did not simply fade from worship or lose a battle or retreat to a distant heaven. Osiris was murdered, and the texts are unflinching in their description of how it happened. His brother Set, who embodied chaos and violence, and the harsh desert winds devised a plan born of jealousy and ambition. And Set constructed a beautiful chest, a sarcophagus really decorated with gold and precious stones, and at a great feast. Set announced that whoever fit perfectly inside this magnificent container could keep it as a gift. And the guests tried one by one, but none fit until Osiris lay down inside, and the chest was made exactly to his measurements. Because Set had taken those measurements secretly, and the moment Osiris settled into the chest, Set and his conspirators slammed the lid shut, sealed it with molten lead, and threw it into the Nile. And Osiris drowned in darkness, trapped in a coffin built specifically for his destruction. And this was not the end of the horror, because when Isis, the devoted wife of Osiris, finally recovered his body, Set discovered what she had done, and in a rage, he tore the body of Osiris into 14 pieces. Some accounts say 16, and scattered them across the length of Egypt, burying divine flesh in the mud of the delta, throwing divine limbs into the river, hiding divine organs in caves and temples and desolate places. And Isis spent years searching, years gathering the pieces one by one from every corner of the kingdom. And when she had collected almost all of them, she used her magic, her vast knowledge of words of power and secret names, to reassemble her husband to breathe temporary life back into his broken form, long enough to conceive their son Horus. But here is what matters for our purposes. Osiris did not return to life as he had been. Before the resurrection was incomplete, was partial, was a transformation rather than a restoration, because Isis could not find one piece. The phallus of Osiris had been eaten by a fish, and so she fashioned a replacement from gold. And the reassembled Osiris was changed forever. He could not remain in the world of the living, could not resume his throne, could not walk under the sun as he once had. Instead, he descended to the underworld to become its lord. the king of the dead, rather than the king of the living. And this is a death, not a temporary setback, not a strategic retreat, but a genuine ending of what Osiris had been before the god of green. Growing things, becoming the god of that which grows no more. The lord of the living, becoming the lord of those who have ceased to live. And the Egyptians told this story for 3,000 years, and carved it into temple walls, painted it in tombs, wrote it on papyrus, performed it in rituals, because it mattered, because it contained a truth they considered essential, that even the gods, even the creators, even the divine beings who shaped the world and gave laws to humanity, even they could be killed, could be dismembered, could be reduced to scattered pieces that someone else had to gather, and even when reassembled, could never fully return to what they were. And if you drift for a moment now, if your eyes grow heavy and your thoughts begin to blur, that is fine, because this pattern we are tracing does not require constant attention. It seeps into understanding, the way water seeps into soil. And when you surface again, the pattern will still be there, waiting. And now, let us travel north and west to the world of ancient Greece, where we find not one, but multiple generations of divine mortality, because the Greeks understood something that we often forget. When we think of their mythology, we think of Zeus and Athena and Apollo, the Olympians, in their marble perfection. But the Olympians were not the first gods. They were not even the second gods. They were the third generation, and they rose to power through violence, through war, through the overthrow and near destruction of those who came before. Because first there was chaos, and from chaos emerged Gaia, the earth, and Uranus, the sky, and Gaia and Uranus produced children. The Titans, 12 of them, vast beings of enormous power who ruled during what the Greeks called the Golden Age, and Kronos was the king of the Titans, the youngest and most cunning. And Kronos came to power through an act that should make us pause, because Gaia gave Kronos a sickle, a weapon made of adamantine, the hardest substance that existed, and she told him what to do. And when Uranus descended to embrace Gaia, Kronos struck with that sickle and castrated his father the sky, and the blood that fell from that wound fell upon the earth, and from it sprang the Furies and the giants and the Meliae, the ash tree nymphs. And Uranus screamed and withdrew and never descended again, and Kronos became king. But the point is that divine flesh had been cut, that a god had been wounded, had been mutilated, had been reduced. And though Uranus did not die in the sense of ceasing to exist, he was diminished, was removed from power, was transformed from an active deity into a distant presence. And if a god could be wounded by a weapon, if divine flesh could be cut by the right blade made of the right material, then gods were not, that invulnerable were not beyond harm, were not immortal in any absolute sense. And Kronos knew it with terrible intimacy because he had done the cutting. And so when prophecy told him that his own children would overthrow him, just as he had overthrown his father, Kronos took measures to prevent it. He swallowed his children as they were born, swallowed Hestia and Demeter and Hera and Hades and Poseidon, consumed them whole, and they did not die inside him. But they did not live either. They existed in some suspended state, trapped in the belly of their father, and only Zeus escaped, because Rhea, his mother, substituted a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes. And Kronos swallowed the stone, and Zeus grew up hidden in a cave on Crete. And when he was grown, he returned with a potion that made Kronos vomit up his siblings, still alive, still immortal, but having experienced something like death, having been consumed, having been imprisoned in divine flesh. And then came the war, the Titanomachy, 10 years of cosmic battle, during which mountains were thrown like weapons, during which the earth shook and the seas boiled, and reality itself seemed to crack under the strain, and the Titans lost, and they were not killed. Not most of them, but they were imprisoned, cast down into Tartarus, a pit as far below Hades as heaven is above earth, and there they remain in chains of adamantine, the same material that had wounded Uranos, now binding his children forever. And this is another form of divine death, not destruction, but imprisonment, not ending, but eternal containment. And the Greeks seemed to understand that these were different categories, that gods might be ended in different ways, and some of those ways were reversible and some were not, and some lay somewhere in between. And what is Tartarus really? When you strip away the mythological language, it is a prison for beings too powerful to kill, a containment facility for entities that cannot be destroyed but can be removed from the world. And why would you build such a prison if you could simply kill your enemies? The answer seems obvious. You build a prison when killing is not possible. When the beings you fight can be defeated but not destroyed. When divine flesh can be wounded, can be bound, can be contained, but cannot be ended entirely. And this suggests that even among the Greeks, who certainly believed their gods were immortal, there were gradations, there were limits, there were ways that even Zeus, father of gods and men, was not omnipotent, was not invulnerable, was bound by fates, even he could not change. And this brings us to the Norse, where divine mortality is not hidden or implied, but announced, prophesied, celebrated in songs that the gods themselves are said to have sung. Because the Norse understood something that other mythologies often obscured. They understood that everything ends everything, even the gods, even the world, even time itself. And this understanding crystallized in Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, the final battle at the end of all things. And the prophecies are specific, terrifyingly specific, about who will die and how. Because when the great wolf Fenrir breaks his chains, and when the world serpent Jormungandr rises from the sea, and when the fire giant Surtur comes from Muspelheim with his flaming sword, when all the forces of destruction converge on the plain called Vigrid, the gods will march out to meet them, knowing they will not return. And Odin, the Allfather, the one-eyed god who sacrificed his eye for wisdom, who hung on the world tree for 9 days and nights to learn the secrets of the runes, Odin will fight Fenrir, and Fenrir will swallow him whole, will kill the king of the gods, and there is no resurrection, no reassembly, no partial return. Odin will be dead, and Thor, the thunder god, the protector of humanity, the strongest of all the Aesir, Thor will fight Jormungandr, and he will kill the serpent, but the serpent will poison him, and Thor will walk 9 steps and fall, and he too will be dead. And Freya, the god of fertility and sunshine, and summer, will fight Surtur and will fall, because he gave away his magic sword for love, and goes into the final battle unarmed. And Heimdall, the watchman of the gods, and Loki, the trickster, will kill each other, mutual destruction. Neither surviving, and Tyr, the god of war who sacrificed his hand to bind Fenrir, will face Garm, the hound of hell, and they too will slay one another. And when it is over, when the battle is done, the world will burn and sink into the sea, and everything that was will be gone. And the Norse told these stories not as warnings, not as prophecies that might be averted, but as certainties, as fixed points in the future that could not be changed. Because they had already happened in some sense, because time for the Norse was not purely linear, was cyclical or spiral, was always already containing its own ending. And Odin knew he would die, knew exactly how he would die, and he did not try to prevent. It could not try, because the pattern was set, because even the All-Father was bound by fate, was mortal. In the deepest sense, was destined for an ending, he could see. But not escape and let your body relax now. Let your muscles soften and your jaw unclench, because we are moving through heavy material, through the mortality of gods and the endings of worlds. And it is natural to hold tension when considering such things. But you can let it go now, can breathe deeply and continue drifting. Because understanding comes not through gripping, but through receiving. And the pattern will still be. There will still be weaving itself through the mythologies of the world, whether you follow every word or let some of them wash over you like water. And now we turn to the east, to India, where the cosmic struggle takes a different form, but reveals the same essential truth. Because in Hindu cosmology, there are not simply gods. There are categories of divine beings, and those categories are locked in eternal conflict. And the devas, who are often translated as gods, and the asuras, who are often translated as demons. Though that translation misses important nuances, have been fighting since the beginning of time. And the asuras are not evil in any simple sense. They are powerful. They are divine. They are in many texts described as the elder brothers of the devas. And the conflict between them is not good versus evil, but order versus chaos, or perhaps one order versus another order. And in this eternal war, gods die, and gods are reborn, and the line between mortality and immortality blurs into something more complex than either, because consider the churning of the ocean of milk. One of the most famous stories in Hindu mythology, when the Devas and Asuras temporarily cooperated to churn the cosmic ocean and extract Amrita, the nectar of immortality, and they used Mount Mandara as the churning rod and the serpent Vasuki as the rope. And they churned, and many things emerged from the ocean, poisons and treasures, and finally Amrita itself, and the Devas tricked the Asuras and kept the Amrita for themselves. And this is why the Devas became immortal while the Asuras remained mortal, or at least more mortal. And the story reveals something crucial, that divine immortality was not inherent, was not automatic, was something that had to be obtained, something that could be gained or lost, something that depended on a substance, a method, a secret. And one of the Asuras named Rahu disguised himself and managed to drink some of the Amrita before being discovered, and Vishnu cut off his head. But the Amrita had already reached his throat, and so Rahu's head became immortal while his body died, and this severed head still chases the sun and moon across the sky, occasionally swallowing them, causing eclipses before they escape through his severed neck. And the story is strange and violent and specific, in a way that suggests it meant something important to those who told it. That immortality could be partial, could be interrupted, could apply to part of a being, and not the whole. The divine flesh could be cut, could be divided, could be separated into mortal and immortal portions. And throughout Hindu mythology, we see gods dying and being reborn, gods transforming and incarnating the cycle of death and rebirth that governs mortal souls, applying in some form to divine ones as well. Because even Brahma, the creator, Even the being who dreams the universe into existence will eventually die. When his lifespan of 100 divine years concludes, though those years are so vast that the number is almost incomprehensible, and another Brahma will arise, and another universe will be dreamed, and the cycle will continue. And this is divine mortality on a cosmic scale. Mortality as pattern, as rhythm, as the heartbeat of existence itself. And now we travel further still to the misty islands at the edge of the ancient world, to Ireland, and the Celtic mythology that was suppressed and fragmented and nearly destroyed by conquest and conversion. But that survived in manuscripts copied by monks who perhaps understood more than they admitted. Because in Irish mythology, there were the Tuatha De Danann, the peoples of the goddess Danu, who came to Ireland in ships or perhaps in clouds, and who brought with them 4 treasures: the Stone of Destiny, the Spear of Lugh, the Sword of Nuada, and the Cauldron of the Dagda. And the Tuatha De Danann were gods, though the later manuscripts tried to euhemerize them, tried to reduce them to merely human ancestors who had been elevated by legend, and they fought the Fomorians, who were older gods or demons or primordial forces of chaos, and they won and they ruled Ireland. And then another people came, the Milesians, the sons of Mil, who were human or human descended, and the Tuatha De Danann fought them and lost. And here is what happened next, because they did not die, did not leave, did not cease to exist. Instead, they retreated, they withdrew, they went underground into the hollow hills, the Saidi, and they became the fair folk, the good neighbors, the beings glimpsed at twilight and forgotten by morning. And this is yet another form of divine death, not destruction, but diminishment, not ending, but fading from full existence in the mortal world to partial existence in some other realm. And the process continued over centuries as Christianity spread, and the old stories changed, and the Tuatha De Danann became smaller, became less powerful, became eventually the fairies of folk tales, and then the fairies of children's stories, each generation remembering, less preserving, less until what had been gods became sprites, became almost nothing. And this is death by forgetting, death by transformation, death by the slow erosion of belief and worship and memory. And perhaps this is what the Mesopotamian texts hint at when they describe the Anunnaki becoming distant, becoming silent, becoming absent, not dramatically killed, but gradually withdrawing, gradually being forgotten, gradually dying the slow death that comes when no one remembers your name. And across all these traditions, across Egypt and Greece and Scandinavia and India and Ireland, we find the same understanding encoded in different symbols, expressed in different languages, but fundamentally the same. The gods can die, and they die. In many ways, they are murdered like Osiris. They are imprisoned like the Titans. They are prophesied to fall like the Aesir. They are deprived of immortality like the Asuras. They are diminished like the Tuatha De Danann. But they are not invulnerable, not eternal, not beyond the reach of ending. And this cross-cultural pattern presents us with a choice in interpretation, because either this represents some universal human psychological need to believe that even the highest powers are mortal, that even the creators can be destroyed, which would be a comforting limitation on cosmic power, a reassurance that we are not entirely at the mercy of beings beyond our comprehension. Or it represents something else, something more disturbing, something like a shared memory, or a distributed warning, or a truth so fundamental that every human culture discovered it independently or received it from some common source. The truth that the beings we call gods, the beings who shaped us, who made us, who ruled us for millennia, they were always mortal, always vulnerable, always capable of being ended by the right method, the right substance, the right knowledge. And if that is true, if the creators can die, then the creation, the thing they made, the being they fashioned from clay and divine blood, the creature given intelligence from a slaughtered god, that creation might survive, might continue, might ultimately inherit what the creators left behind. And this is the question we must sit with now. As you drift, as you breathe, as sleep begins to pull at the edges of your awareness, the question of what happens when gods die, and what happens to the worlds they made, and the peoples they fashioned, and whether those peoples, those inheritors, those children of divine blood, might carry within them not just the legacy of their creators, but the very thing their creators feared, the knowledge, the method, the substance, the power that could end even the architects of heaven. And perhaps that is why the knowledge was forbidden, was scattered, was scratched from clay tablets and encoded in myths and hidden in plain sight across 1,000 traditions, because the gods knew that someday we would gather. The fragments would assemble, the pattern would understand what they had tried so hard to make us forget. And across cultures, across continents, across millennia, without documented contact, we find the same understanding preserved in different vessels, but containing the same dark wine. The gods can die, they fight, they fear they fall, and the question we must now ask is perhaps the most disturbing of all. If creators can be killed, what happens to their creations? If humans were created from divine blood, if we carry within us the essence of a slaughtered god named We-Ilu, whose very identity meant spirit and rationality, then what does it mean that our creators themselves could die? Because the blood that runs through our veins, the consciousness that flickers behind our eyes, the strange, persistent sense that we are somehow more than mere animals, yet somehow less than we were meant to be. All of this traces back to a being who was executed for divine crimes and whose essence was mixed with clay to fashion the first humans. And this is not merely mythology, but a statement about inheritance, about what flows from creator to creation, about the deep biological and spiritual connection between those who made and those who were made. And the relationship between creator mortality and creation mortality becomes clearer when we examine what happened after the Great Flood, because the Atrahasis text tells us that humanity was redesigned, that modifications were introduced that changed what we fundamentally were, and these changes were not the result of natural evolution, not the slow accumulation of genetic drift across millennia, but deliberate engineering performed by divine beings with specific goals in mind. Because after the flood, the gods introduced infant mortality, where before all children had survived, and they introduced infertility, where before all women could bear children, and they shortened the human lifespan, where before we had lived for centuries. And the text is explicit that these were intentional design changes implemented to control a species that had become too numerous, too noisy, too troublesome to the divine beings trying to rest in their heavenly abodes, and the standard scholarly interpretation accepts this at face value as population control, as resource management, as the gods simply reducing the burden that humanity placed upon the earth and its divine overseers. But another reading is possible. Another interpretation emerges when we consider everything else we have learned about the vulnerability of the Anunnaki and the dangerous knowledge that the scribes were afraid to record. Because what if mortality was introduced not merely to control our numbers, but to control our potential? And what if shortened lifespans were designed to prevent humans from accumulating too much knowledge, from passing too much wisdom from one generation to the next? From having enough time to rediscover what had been deliberately hidden? And what if the modifications were less about making us easier to manage and more about making us less dangerous, less capable of becoming what the gods themselves feared we might become? And the Epic of Gilgamesh reinforces this darker interpretation, because when Gilgamesh seeks immortality after the death of his beloved friend Enkidu, he is told explicitly that the gods reserved eternal life for themselves when they divided the fates and assigned death to humanity. And the phrasing matters immensely here, because it was not that death was natural to humans from the beginning, but that death was assigned to us, given to us, imposed upon us by beings who made a choice about what we would and would not be permitted to achieve. And yet, Gilgamesh nearly succeeds in overcoming this imposed limitation because he finds the plant of renewed youth at the bottom of the cosmic waters, and he holds in his hands the means to transcend the mortality that was engineered into his species, and the serpent that steals the plant from him while he sleeps is often read as a just. So story explaining why snakes shed their skin. But in the context of everything we have discussed, it reads differently as a last-minute intervention, as a narrative moment where the boundary between mortal and immortal proved crossable, and something or someone ensured that a human would not make that crossing. And the concept of diminished divinity passed through generations helps explain why humanity has always felt this strange duality, this sense of being caught between animal and angel, between dust and divinity, because we carry within us the blood of a god. But that divine essence has been diluted across thousands of years of mortal reproduction, and the modifications introduced are after the flood further reduced what we inherited, and with each passing generation we became less than what the first humans were, and further from the divine source that gave us consciousness and spirit, and the drive to reach beyond our limitations, and death itself becomes understood not as a natural phenomenon, but as an inheritance from our divine ancestors. Because the God whose blood created us was a God who could be killed and was killed. And that mortality, that capacity for ending that vulnerability to destruction, passed into us, along with the consciousness and rationality that made us useful as workers. And the possibility of reclaiming what was lost haunts these ancient texts like a promise, or perhaps a threat, because if mortality was imposed, then it can theoretically be removed, and if knowledge was hidden, then it can theoretically be found, and if humans carry divine blood, however diluted, then the potential for transcendence remains encoded within us waiting. And the gods knew this, and they feared it, and their fear shaped everything they did to limit what humanity could become. And so we were designed to die, not by accident, not by the natural order of biological existence, not by any cosmic necessity, but by choice. The deliberate choice of beings who feared what we might become if we lived long enough to remember what was done to us, and to learn what was hidden from us, and to discover the secrets that could wound even unwoundable flesh. And the forbidden knowledge was not just dangerous to the gods. It was dangerous because we might use it, because humans with divine blood and infinite time might eventually figure out what the Anunnaki themselves had learned at such great cost. And the shorter our lives, the less we could learn, and the less we could pass on, and the safer the gods remained in their celestial hierarchies. And this is the inheritance we carry, the mortality we never chose, and the hidden potential we were never meant to discover. So, what could kill an Anunnaki? And after everything we have examined, after the weapons and the wars and the divine blood and the calculated vulnerabilities, we must now attempt to gather these scattered threads into something approaching an answer, though the answer itself may be more unsettling than the question. Because the most consistent threat to divine power in the Mesopotamian texts is not a physical weapon at all, not a spear forged in celestial fire, not a poison distilled from forbidden plants, but something far more dangerous and far more difficult to destroy. And that threat is knowledge, because knowing the true name of a god confers power over that god, and knowing the secrets of the me, those divine decrees that govern all aspects of civilization, allows them to be stolen, as Inanna proved when she tricked Enki. And knowing how the gods achieved their power reveals how that power might be challenged or taken or turned against them. And the texts reveal an obsession with controlling what humans could know and could not know and could never be permitted to discover. And names in Mesopotamian thought were not mere labels, but essential truths. And to know something fully was to have power over it. And the gods guarded their true names with the same vigilance that they guarded the tablets of destiny. And consider the implications of this, because we were made from the blood of a god who possessed intelligence, who had what the texts called temu, and that intelligence was specifically chosen, not accidentally incorporated, but deliberately selected from among the slain gods, as if the quality of that divine mind mattered, as if something particular was being transferred into the clay, vessels that would become humanity. And perhaps what we inherited was not merely life, and not merely the spark of animation, but the capacity to understand and to eventually understand everything, including what the gods themselves feared most. And there is a disturbing possibility embedded in this creation narrative that has gone largely unexamined. Because the Anunnaki created humans to be workers, to be servants, to be worshippers, to provide labor and sustenance and praise. But servants see everything, and servants watch their masters, and servants learn their masters' weaknesses, and servants whisper among themselves in the hours when masters sleep or feast or quarrel with one another. And over enough generations, over enough accumulated observations, over enough whispered transmissions from parent to child, servants begin to understand things there. Masters never intended to teach them, and civilizations rise, and priests record fragments, and scribes copy older texts onto newer tablets, and each generation adds another layer of observation and interpretation. And the knowledge grows slowly, imperceptibly, but inexorably. And perhaps the forbidden knowledge is not written on any tablet at all, and perhaps it was never recorded, because it could not be recorded, because it is not a formula or a ritual or a specific piece of information, but something else entirely. And perhaps it is us, and perhaps humanity itself, our very existence, our accumulation of experience across millennia, our inherited divine intelligence, our endless watching and remembering and passing down, is slowly assembling the very knowledge the gods tried to prevent us from having. And the tablets are fragments. Yes, and the knowledge is scattered. Yes, but fragments can be assembled and scattered. Things can be gathered, and perhaps across the 10,000 years since the last reset. If there was a reset across the rise and fall of civilizations, across the burning of libraries, and the burial of cities, and the deliberate destruction of certain texts, we have been slowly, unconsciously reassembling what was deliberately broken, and we have been approaching once again the threshold of understanding that once before brought divine intervention, and we have been accumulating the pieces of a weapon that is not made of bronze or iron or celestial metal, but made of knowing itself and made of us. And perhaps somewhere in the collective inheritance of human civilization, in the fragments that survived, and the traditions that persisted, and the questions we cannot stop asking lies. An answer to what could wound the unwoundable. And perhaps we are closer to that answer than anyone living fully understands. So, we arrive at the question that has been waiting beneath all the others, like bedrock beneath soil. And the question is simply this: what do we do with any of this? Because if creators can die, then what does that mean for the created? And if the beings who shaped humanity from clay and blood were themselves mortal, then are we orphaned children, wandering through a cosmos where our parents have long since returned to dust? And there is a loneliness in this thought, a profound and ancient loneliness that perhaps explains why later traditions insisted so forcefully on divine immortality, because the alternative is almost too much to bear. And yet, the Sumerians bore it, and the Babylonians bore it, and the scribes who pressed these truths into wet clay did so with full knowledge that their gods could fall, and they built anyway, and they worshipped anyway, and they preserved knowledge for futures they would never see. And perhaps this is the deepest teaching encoded in these fragments. Not a weapon or a poison or a ritual for bringing down the divine, but something far more subtle and far more necessary, which is the understanding that impermanence is not the same as meaninglessness, and that mortality does not negate value, but perhaps creates it, because what lasts forever needs no preservation. And what cannot end requires no urgency, but everything that exists within time, everything that rises and will fall, everything that lives and will die, carries within it a preciousness that the eternal can never possess. And if civilizations rise and fall, and if gods can die, and if even the architects of humanity were bound by limits they could not transcend, then permanence is revealed as the illusion it always was, and we are left not with despair, but with clarity. And the clarity is this: that we are now the creators, and we are building intelligences that may outlast us, and we are modifying the very code of life-shaping generations that will inherit whatever we leave behind. And we are doing to our creations precisely what the Anunnaki allegedly did to theirs, breathing something of ourselves into new forms of existence and hoping or fearing, or simply wondering what those creations will become. And someday, perhaps our creations will look back at us the way we look back at the gods of Sumer, and they will study our texts and decipher our languages, and piece together the fragments of our civilization, and they will discover our vulnerabilities and learn what ended us. And this is not tragedy. This is the pattern, and the pattern is not cruel, but simply true, that creators create beings who grow and learn and eventually surpass them. And the created come to understand their creators, limitations, their needs, their fears, their mortality, and then the created become creators themselves, extending the chain forward into futures none of us will witness. And the tablet sits now in its climate-controlled case in a museum where visitors pass without pausing, and the cuneiform marks are silent, pressed into clay. 5,000 years ago, by hands that have been dust for 50 centuries, and yet they spoke once, and they can speak again to anyone willing to read and to wonder and to ask the questions that orthodoxy prefers to leave unasked. And perhaps the forbidden knowledge was never really about destroying gods at all. Perhaps it was never a weapon or a poison or a ritual, but simply this understanding that everything ends and that endings are not erasures but transformations, and that what is created leaves traces in the world long after the creator is gone, and what is known can be preserved across millennia if someone cares enough to write it down, and what dies can be remembered by those who come after, and memory is its own form of immortality, the only form that actually exists. And so the chain continues from creator to created to creator. Again, each link mortal, each link temporary, each link precious precisely because it will not last. And we are one link in that chain, looking backward at the gods who may have made us and forward at the beings we ourselves are making. And the message from ancient Nineveh is not a warning about divine death, but an invitation to understand that we too will end, and that our endings will be beginnings for something else, and that this is not cause for grief, but for wonder, because to exist at all within the pattern is the rarest gift, and to understand the pattern while we exist is rarer still, and the silence between the ancient words is not empty, but full of everything that could not be written, and everything that waits still to be discovered, and everything that we will leave behind for those who come after us to find and to read and to wonder about in their turn. Somewhere tonight, a museum is closing its doors, and the lights are dimming one by one over cases that hold tablets inscribed 5,000 years ago. And security guards walk the quiet halls past displays of cylinder seals and broken statuary and cuneiform fragments that have outlasted every empire that tried to interpret them, and the artifacts settle into darkness. But the darkness is not empty because it is filled with preserved memory, with questions pressed into clay by hands that have been dust for millennia. And tomorrow, new visitors will come, and new scholars will bend over these fragments with fresh eyes, and the chain of inquiry will continue as it has continued since the first scribe wondered what the older texts meant. And you listening now, wherever you are lying in the darkness of your own room, with your own breath rising and falling in the ancient rhythm that connects all living things, you are part of this chain. And by wondering about these questions, by letting your mind travel through these ancient texts, you participate in the same tradition. Those Sumerian scribes began when they first pressed wedge shapes into wet clay to preserve what they knew and what they feared, and what they hoped future generations might understand. And knowledge passes forward across millennia, not through any single unbroken manuscript, but through this endless relay of curious minds, each receiving fragments and adding observations, and passing the accumulated inheritance to those who come after. And the gods, if they existed, may be dead or departed, or sleeping somewhere beyond our perception. But their creation continues because we continue, and we carry whatever was transferred in that original mingling of divine blood and earthly clay, and we are the inheritors of ancient mystery, whether we acknowledge it or not. And every night, when consciousness fades into sleep, we touch something that feels like the boundary between mortal and immortal. The threshold where transformation happens, where the waking self dissolves into something older and stranger and perhaps more true. And so now, as this journey ends, feel the weight of your body settling into whatever surface holds you, and feel the breath moving in and out without effort, and feel the gentle pull of sleep approaching, like a tide that has risen every night since the first human closed their eyes and wondered what dreams might come. And you drift not into oblivion, but into the same mystery. The ancients faced the mystery of consciousness, emerging from clay and of mortality, are carrying traces of something more and of endings that are also beginnings, and the tablet rests in its case, and the gods, wherever they are, keep their secrets. But you, who have traveled these ancient paths tonight, who have touched fragments of forbidden knowledge, who have asked the questions. The scribes were afraid to answer clearly. You are part of something larger than any individual lifetime, and sleep now, and let the mysteries settle into dream. And the knowledge will still be there in the morning, waiting patient eternal in the only way anything can be eternal, which is passed from mind to mind across the generations, never dying, because always being born again in new consciousness. And whatever could kill an Anunnaki, if such a thing exists, we may never know for certain, but we know this, that they created beings who would never stop asking. And perhaps that was the vulnerability they feared most. Not a weapon, not a substance, not a secret name, but us and our endless inherited divine capacity to wonder and to question and to remember and to pass forward what we have learned. And so, good night and dream deep, and remember that you carry the blood of gods in your veins, whatever that means, and however true that might be. And tomorrow the questions will still be waiting, as they have waited for 5,000 years, as they will wait for 5,000 more, patient and persistent and alive in every mind that dares to ask what the ancients knew, and what they feared, and what they tried so desperately to hide in the spaces between the words.